From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump holds a vice presidential casting call at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. Who seems to be in the running, and what should President Trump be looking for in a 2024 running mate? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. Last weekend, the Republican National Committee had a spring retreat at the Mar-a-Lago Club in Florida with many donors down there to meet and greet. And among the guests were several candidates who have been discussed as potential running mates for President Trump, including South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, Florida's own Marco Rubio, and South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem. And that has fueled much speculation this week about which of these contestants on The New Apprentice might have the stuff to win the grand prize. Now, let's listen to a few of them. This is Tim Scott on Meet the Press, followed by Doug Burgum on CNN and J.D. Vance on Scripps News.
Do you think you're on the short list?
I hope that the president will choose a person who helps the country unite and heal. I certainly expect to have a decision from President Trump in the next 60 days or so, but he did not bring it up. I certainly didn't bring it up.
Any of that right now is all speculation. I mean, as you opened the show talking about the beef steaks and a group of people on stage, you couldn't get if you'd had any more on there, they'd have been falling off the stage. And prior to that, he said there was a 50. So I think the short list needs to be modified. Maybe there's a list of 50. If I'm on it, who would know? But it's not why I'm out supporting the president right now.
My attitude on it is I'm going to focus on doing my job for the people of Ohio. I don't talk about vice presidency. I'm not really focused on it. I think it's really important that we reelect Donald Trump, and I think I can do a very good job for the people of Ohio and also supporting the broader Trump agenda from the perch of the United States Senate. So we'll see what happens. If he asks me, certainly I'd be interested, but he hasn't asked me yet, and we'll see if he does.
Everybody, of course, denies that they are jockeying for the Veep slot. That is part of the formula. Politicians are used to saying, I'm not at all focused on this higher office that I'm secretly yearning for with every fiber of my being. But Kim, am I wrong to think that that's what's going on here? And from your perspective, who do you think is at the top of the running mate list?
So obviously everyone is jockeying. That is what you do if you have ambitions for higher office. The Veep stakes is about as big as it gets. We can look at the people who were down at that event: Tim Scott, J.D. Vance, Doug Burgum, Marco Rubio, Kristi Noem, Elise Stefanik, Byron Donalds, the congressman from Florida, quite a few others. I think it's impossible to say if anyone is in pole position for a number of reasons. Donald Trump is clearly keeping the field very large on purpose, not necessarily singling people out, not signaling his intention. It's interesting. Apparently, his campaign is not doing what many campaigns often do, which is to send out questionnaires to potential candidates, which is one way often of allowing the press to get a better sense of who really is in the running. But also, this is just very Donald Trump. I think that he could go any way at any time. And to suggest that there's someone who's leading now means very little, because that could change tomorrow. Campaign is clearly doing a deep dive into a ton of different folks. He gave some shout outs to specific people when he was down at that event. He gave a glowing praise to Elise Stefanik, who is obviously a congresswoman and a member of the House leadership. He shouted out to J.D. Vance, pointed out that he didn't used to really like him, or J.D. Vance didn't like him. Now he's turned out to be incredible. Praised Tim Scott for being an incredible surrogate, and Doug Burgum for being a very successful businessman. This could really go any way. And I think the way to look at it now is that he's got a very, very broad field, possibly even containing some pretty unlikely characters, and anything is possible.
And Mene, do you agree with that assessment? It's true that it's still early. I think that Donald Trump wants to use this apprentice show for every moment of press that it's worth. And so we may be a long way from the announcement, and he may change his mind along the way. If you look at the things that Chris Christie has written about what happened in 2016, it sounds like Christie was very interested and thought he might be pretty close to getting it. And then he found out that Mike Pence was landing at the Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, potentially coming to see President Trump. But I'm curious if you think that there are any clear frontrunners out of this stack of politicians who seem like they're lined up trying to get the job.
Absolutely. It doesn't seem as if there's clear evidence that anyone is in the top spot. I agree wholly with Kim that Trump seems to be in no hurry to make a decision, wants to try to milk the process for a long period of time, in part because he genuinely enjoys it. I think that having Chris Christie on a yo-yo was a great source of enjoyment for him in 2016. And you might also recall when he brought in Mitt Romney for that interview about potentially being Secretary of State, probably knowing that he had no interest in actually appointing him to that position in the end. But he loves the idea of having all of these people from around the Republican Party all vying for his attention, praising him both in public and behind closed doors. And then ultimately he's going to make a decision based on a combination of who he thinks is going to help and his own personal whims about who he would like to see in that spot. It's interesting that the campaign also is probably still trying to read the direction of the race and make a determination about who would help Trump's candidacy the most. In 2016, I don't think Mike Pence was necessarily on the top of people's shortlist in the public of who they expected to be the pick, but it ended up being a very sound one because they realized as the race was continuing along that they really needed to shore up that support among evangelical voters, among traditionally conservative voters, and they wanted someone with establishment experience. And so despite Trump's unconventionality, I think that he understands the dynamics of the race. I think that the people advising him also do. And in the end, they're going to try to see, as they get closer to the July convention, what is the biggest vulnerability in our campaign and who can we pick to help us gain a little bit of extra advantage against Joe Biden in the general election.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. The example of Mike Pence in 2016 provides some food for thought because that was clearly an attempt by President Trump to shore up his support among social conservatives, traditionalists, people who may have been skeptical of this brash New York real estate guy, a former Democrat who had been all over the map in his public statements on all kinds of issues. And so, Kim, I don't think that Donald Trump, as we sit here today, has that same kind of vulnerability among those voters, but he does have other vulnerabilities. And maybe he's thinking that a vice presidential pick is a way to bring over some voters in these swing states. And you could go a couple directions. You could pick a guy like Tim Scott and try to make a play for more non-white voters. Tim Scott was a key part of the 2020 Republican convention, got a very prominent role there. And I think there is some evidence that that strategy had some success. President Trump, I think, did better in some of these big cities like Milwaukee in 2020 than he did in 2016. Another way would be to pick a woman vice president. President Trump has struggled among suburban voters, suburban moms, or just somebody maybe like Doug Burgum, a Midwestern governor who seems like a nice guy. So, Kim, what do you make of that aspect of this, a running mate as an attempt to shore up a political weakness?
I hope he's thinking that way, okay? He's undoubtedly getting a lot of advice right now that falls more in the traditional categories of how people argue and why people argue you should choose specific people. I'm sure he's getting advice that he should take on a candidate that could win over certain target groups of voters, say minority voters. And they'd be making the case for Tim Scott or Marco Rubio, or I've heard Ben Carson, the former head of the HUD department in the Trump administration, Byron Donalds. He might be being told you need to pick an outsider, really, shake things up in this race. People have talked about Tulsi Gabbard or Tucker Carlson. I find that a little less likely. He might be being told you should care about the money side of it and who can help you with your fundraising and who has cash themselves that they could put toward this campaign. But I agree with you, Kyle, that what helped him most, in fact, what was essential to his election in 2016, which let's not forget was pretty close, was having Mike Pence there as stability and shoring up those who were very concerned about him. And he needs to do the same thing now. Look, we just had a Indiana primary, Nikki Haley isn't even running anymore, and she got 20% of the vote. And that suggests there does remain a significant faction of the Republican Party, maybe those that are more moderate, independent-minded, that remain uncomfortable with Donald Trump. I agree with some of those names that you mentioned. I think Nikki Haley, though it seems unlikely, she hasn't even endorsed him yet, and there certainly was some bad blood there. She is another person in that category, a person you haven't heard a ton about in terms of vice presidential material or being on Trump's radar screen, but I think also would be someone there as Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, for instance, maybe Elise Stefanik from New York, who I mentioned earlier. She's in the House leadership. I think it's important, too, for not just Donald Trump to get elected, but if he were to get elected, this is a question of his success in office. Look, Mike Pence was very good because he was a policy guy. And even though Donald Trump came into office with some populist policies, the things that really made him successful was the Reaganite agenda that he enacted in tax cuts and deregulation, etc. And so having someone, I think, that is both very steeped in policy, a professional, and can appeal to some of those independents could really make all the difference to him in both election, but how he governs in a second term.
Nikki Haley is an interesting thought. The runner-up in the Republican primaries, though, the margin that President Trump eventually secures the nomination by is going to be quite wide. But it is noticeable, I think, that in some of these states, after she's dropped out, she's still winning 20% or more of the vote. But, Monet, a couple thoughts there. Even though Nikki Haley might be the strongest pick for President Trump electorally and might be someone who voters would look at and think there is a vice presidential candidate who could do the job if she is required to step into the Oval Office, I do wonder whether, A, President Trump would have any interest in picking her, because he seems to like people that don't take pride in standing up to him. And he seems to think that that was part of the mistake that he had in picking Mike Pence. And two, I wonder whether Nikki Haley would even take it, because she seems to be betting, or one plausible thing is that she might be betting that if President Trump loses, then she would be next in line as a presidential candidate potentially in 2028.
Yes, I think you're reading Nikki Haley's current thinking accurately. I do think there was an opportunity after Trump rolled up those Super Tuesday primary states for Nikki Haley to pivot and endorse him the way that the other primary contenders like Ron DeSantis and Tim Scott did upon dropping out. The reason that she didn't do that and has continued to hold out as the primaries have gone on is in part because she wants to maintain an independent political brand. It's been reported that she's still very much in touch with her supporters and donors, and she held an event in Charleston very recently to thank them and presumably to continue to strategize, because she is trying to keep her own base of support active and potentially positioning for a future presidential run. And so it's quite likely that even though we know Trump isn't likely to offer her that position, that she would decline it if it were offered, because she is betting that Trump is not likely to win and also wants to keep an eye on her own political future. But I do think that Trump has to be reading those primary results, losing such a huge chunk of Republican voters in each one of these states, continuing despite the fact that he doesn't have opposition, and thinking about how he can pick someone who will appeal to that type of voter. Every indication for now is that, at least publicly, he's signaling he's not worried about it. He'll come out after these primaries and say, all of those voters are going to come home to me in the end. And he's probably right about most of them. But as you pointed out, the margin of victory either way in some of these states is going to be so small that he can't afford to take them for granted. And so if he wants to pick somebody who fits more closely with his own political brand and somebody who is much more willing to praise him and get on board with his agenda, that's all well and good. But he just has to make sure that that's someone who's also going to have a certain amount of appeal to more moderate conservatives in some of these swing states, and is going to appeal to a type of voter who is at least a little bit cool to him at the current moment.
Sorry to have brought up 2028, but that is a nice segue to another issue here, Kim, which is that there is a wide ideological spectrum represented in the people who are being discussed as potential running mates for President Trump. People who I think are more traditionalist, Reaganite conservatives, maybe Tim Scott, Doug Burgum, and then people who have gone over to the populist MAGA wing of the party, J.D. Vance and to some extent Marco Rubio. And part of what makes this important is that if President Trump wins in 2024, he's limited to 2 terms. So someone else is going to be the putative leader of the Republican Party after he leaves office. And President Trump's choice here of who will be by his side for these next 4 years, if he makes it back to the White House, would be huge, I think, in setting the direction of the Republican Party.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the way I think to look at this is that both men who are running, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, are essentially incumbents. And so they are limited to just 4 more years. And so in some ways, this sweepstakes has an even higher moment attached to it because it's in some ways the anointing of a successor and therefore a point in the direction of the future of the party. And the party sits at a very critical juncture. Right now, the vast majority, I think, of those out there voting, and many in Congress, for instance, are what you would call more traditional Reagan conservatives. But there is this push among some to go much more in a populist route on everything from trying to throw more entitlements out there, only those that are meant to appeal to conservative voters, like the child tax credit, for instance, a much more isolationist view when it comes to foreign policy. Obviously hostile in many ways to trade, or certainly more friendly to the idea of tariffs and trade wars. Obviously, too, this has become a more generalized view held among the party that obviously we have to do something about the border and we really need to reestablish control and security. But I think the populist side of the party has been moving still away from any kind of immigration, even legal immigration. So big choices for the party to confront. And I agree with Monet. There's going to be an impulse on Trump's part to choose someone that's totally loyal to him and isn't going to argue with him and isn't going to push back, because that's just the way he is. And I think he has some bad memories of the pushback he got from various advisors the first time around. But it was those advisors and that pushback, again, I would note, made his term successful. And I think that he would help himself by choosing someone that is not only going to reassure, I think, some of those independents out there that are less in the populist camp, but also he could really help settle some of the storm in the party right now in these divisions, were he to choose someone that had a slightly more Reaganite view of the world.